Actually, it's church and state,
Oh, church and state. My
not
apologies.
religion and politics.
Oh.
But presumably they're related. I want to make just a few observations today. First, I'm going to identify what I think or believe to be the current and dangerous relationship that exists between church and state, particularly in the United States at the beginning of the 21st century. Secondly, I want to indicate briefly why I think that relationship is an example of neo-paganism, or perhaps more curiously, a brand of theocratic politics with the complicity of the church. And third, I want to indicate what I and others think the appropriate relationship between church and state should be. So, in all of this, I want to draw our attention to the gods we worship, both state and church, and to the elements of that worship that are motivated by power and by fear. And I have to begin by confessing that I am motivated in what I say today by one of my early heroes, American heroes, Roger Williams of Rhode Island, who once he was enlarged from Massachusetts, that's a fancy word for saying kicked out, said, "Forced worship stinks in God's nostrils." I hope we have some time for a discussion. So let's begin. John Milbank, who is a Christian theologian, professor of religion and politics and ethics, and one of the founders of what has come to be known as radical orthodoxy, raised some disturbing and provocative questions about the reaction to the attack on the United States, the World Trade Center, in 9/11. And the first question he asked was, why is there so much outrage about this all over the world? Setting aside the spectacular nature of the event, he points out that people are killed in large numbers on a pretty regular basis. By terror, by politics, by economic oppression, without that particular kind of outrage. And Milbank's answer to his question is just as disturbing and provocative as the question itself. He argues that the outrage to 9/11 is primarily explained by the fact that it was an assault on the sovereignty of the state. And it is the sovereign state, after all, that has exclusive right over life and death. It's the sovereign state that may execute people. It's the sovereign state that can pass laws that lengthen the lives of some and shorten the lives of others. The sovereign state can fight wars. It can punish those who take upon themselves the right of life and death. And September 11, he argues, placed all of that into confusion. September 11 was not war because only the sovereign state can wage that kind of war. Indeed, what makes September 11 unique and dangerous, at least to the community of sovereign states, is that it was a direct assault on the very notion of the state itself and on the very notion of sovereignty itself. What Milbank does in the course of making his argument is invite us to look at the rhetoric following the attack. And notice the pieties that were uttered about how dangerous terrorism is, when in fact it has been the sovereign state that has used, and I quote, unabashed physical and psychological terror against civilians as a primary instrument of war, in contradiction to all traditions of Christian teaching and even practice. And the churches are largely silent in the face of that kind of action by the sovereign state. So what's unique about terrorism is the fact that it has been taken up as a tactic formerly used by the sovereign state and now assumed as power that's supposed to belong to sovereign states alone. Now, Milbank's second answer or response to his question is equally or similarly provocative. He argues that there was in many of the leaders of sovereign states following 9/11, including the United States, a renewed sense of purpose, if not outright glee, at the opportunity now to do some things that the West in particular had been waiting to do for some time. Namely, to engage in a continuous war, an endless war against terrorism and the rogue states that are often part of it. Secondly, to police the world markets so that the free market could not be exploited by those who are the enemies of capitalism. And third, and above all, to reinstate the principle of state sovereignty. Maybe even, in the case of neoconservatives, to reinstate the desire for empire. Now that's, as I say, a provocative and interesting reaction to 9/11, but it's not one that can be easily dismissed. And the question that it raises is, from whence did this notion of sovereignty emerge? How has it manifested itself in the modern world? And there's no better person, no better spokesperson for the notion or philosophy of sovereignty than Thomas Hobbes. Some of you may know of Hobbes, a 17th century thinker, philosopher of England, who managed during the Glorious Revolution to offend both the revolutionaries and the royalists. He did so by engaging in what has become famously known as a thought experiment. Imagine, he says to us, that you existed in a state of nature where you enjoyed pure freedom and pure liberty. Imagine further that there are no restraints on that liberty. There is no government. Imagine even further that each of us behaves or acts as if each of us, as individuals, alone, has a set of interests to be satisfied. In other words, imagine that we are egoistic, self-interested creatures, if you prefer, sinful creatures. What would such an imagined world be like? Well, Hobbes has a colorful answer. Life would be solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. To which some pundits add, thank God it's short. And we would engage, he says, in a perpetual war of all against all. Now there is, he says, a saving grace. It's a curious thing on which to build a political system, but it's there. And it's a curious thing because it lies in response to the classical tradition, which says that we are social and political creatures by nature, and that we need to search for right order or justice. But Hobbes will have none of that. He rejects that tradition. Our peculiar saving grace as human beings, above all else, is that we fear death. And that's the foundation on which we engage in what he calls the social contract. We create an entity to govern us with absolute power, or sovereignty. We give up all of our rights, save one, the right to life, and create the sovereign to protect us. The sovereign is not a party to the contract. The sovereign is the creation of the contract. And its primary obligation, some would say its only obligation, is to maintain order and to keep us, in other words, from killing one another.